first presentation here will be given by Ioannis DAFNOMILIS, and he will talk about exploring the impact of the COVID pandemic on global emission projections. We already have him here on stage, so Ioannis, the floor is yours.
Yeah, thank you, Peter, for the introduction. Right, welcome everyone. My name is Ioannis DAFNOMILIS. I'm from the PBL Netherlands Environmental Assessment Agency, where I work as a researcher, and I will be presenting our work that we've done so far on exploring the impact of the COVID-19 pandemic on global emission projections, and some of our current and future work as well. This work was performed along with my colleagues mentioned here, and as a brief outline, we will be going over the COVID impact on emissions up to 2030, our assessment on green versus green recovery, and we'll be talking also about some COVID recovery scenarios that we're developing right now. So as you probably know by now, besides the socioeconomic impact and impact on health and energy use, the pandemic has had a substantial impact on CO2 emissions. For 2020, the projections show a global emission reduction of 4 to 8% compared to 2019, depending on parameters such as the lockdown situation, how long the lockdowns last, how strict they are, etc. Most of this reduction, almost 60%, comes from reduction in aviation and road transport and electricity demand. Part of it is, of course, due to the temporary drop in activity due to the lockdowns, but also because of the increasing weight of renewables in the energy mix. So what we did, basically, we tried to explore some projections up to 2030 regarding global greenhouse gas and CO2 emissions. So when we account for the pandemic's effects on GDP growth, our predictions for 2030 show a reduction between 2.5 to 4.5 gigatons of CO2, which is approximately 4 to 7% reduction compared to pre-COVID current policies projection. The two numbers mentioned above apply to the IMF's baseline and longer and new outbreak scenarios, respectively, as they were reported in April 2020. We also explored the two cases with lower decarbonization rates. We call them rebound to fossil fuels scenarios, where the emissions reduction in 2030 is projected to be smaller, -3 instead of -4.5 gigatons of CO2, or may even turn into an increase for the baseline scenario of half a gigaton CO2. As far as the Paris Agreement goals are concerned, the pandemic is expected to have little effect so far, since it has not been accompanied by structural changes. We would need a consistent, similar rate of decrease maintained for years in order to achieve the 1.5 degree target. Also, at this point, it's important to mention that we have not used our IAM image model so far for these projections. These are just explorative scenarios using CAIADO decomposition and existing model projections with GDP and decarbonization rate data up to June 2020. We also performed a green recovery assessment. We built on the classification by Vivid Economics, where we include the neutral category and expanded the coverage to economy-wide measures and not just sectoral measures. As expected, the green are measures that trigger investments in low-carbon technologies or support R&D of such technologies, such as bailouts with green strings attached or green R&D subsidies. Gray or red measures are the measures that reinforce an unsustainable business-as-usual scenario or new carbon-intensive investments, such as new investment in fossil fuel power plants, for example. In the neutral categories, the measures that do not have a direct impact on emissions, so they cannot clearly be distinguished in green or gray categories, such as digitalization of infrastructure or economy-wide VAT reductions. We also took account of only recovery measures and not the immediate rescue measures implemented by government, such as support for the healthcare sector or measures of that scope. So we broke down the economic recovery packages in single components into the respective budgets and sectoral allocation. And we have been continuously tracking and evaluating these economic recovery packages. In our report published in September, we used Germany as a pilot case study, given its detailed information at that point and its general relevance for European Union. But as I will be talking right after, we're expanding the scope to cover all major CO2 emitters. What we're working on now in IMAGE is on two scenarios directly related to recovery from COVID. We're working with Cambridge Econometrics, E3 modeling from the National Technical University of Athens and the IIASA. Basically, there is a green recovery scenario where we explore what can happen under an optimistic point of view, and an implemented recovery scenario where we explore what will most possibly happen under an announced measures scenario. Before we do that, however, we needed to establish a common baseline between all the models of the consortium. As mentioned before, we collaborated with Cambridge Econometrics and E3 modeling, which are macroeconomic models. They provided us with economic indicators such as GDP projections and value-added projections based on a compilation of data from IMF, World Bank, and OECD, and their own model results, which we implement in IMAGE. The results from IMAGE are very much in accordance to the projections of IMF, World Bank, and OECD, so about a 5% reduction in global GDP for 2020. However, the effect on the emissions was not exactly equal to what we see happening in reality. It only shows a 0.5% reduction in emissions, and that, of course, is because one of the main drivers of IMAGE, of the emissions in IMAGE, is GDP, but actually this pandemic had a much more pronounced shock effect in several sectors, such as aviation, industry, ground transport, and power, which are not uniquely captured by GDP reduction. So what we're working on is right now is establishing the implementation of these reduced activity levels for each sector into the IMAGE model. And once that is done, and in parallel, we have been developing our green recovery scenario. As a general rule, we are following IEA Sustainable Recovery Plan concerning the split of investments between different sectors. We assume 1% of GDP in 2020 will be invested internally within a country or a region for 3 years, up to 2023. But we also use a tailored approach where we use the green stimulus that is so far identifiable and modelable, the so-called good practices countries such as South Korea and EU as well. The final breakdown of investments within the sectors, within the respective policies in each sector, is performed by our consortium and doesn't follow the IEA's breakdown that you can see here. And additionally, we will be implementing a real recovery scenario. For this, we're also additionally collaborating with the New Climate Institute, which was our main collaborator for our initial report, where we break down the recovery measures again in green, gray, red, and neutral, and of all the 10 top major emitters globally. And we will explore their impact on emission trajectories. Again, we will be using our colleagues from the macroeconomic models from Cambridge Econometrics and E3 modeling to account for the effects of the economic recovery measures. But we will also be implementing the measures in IMAGE itself. And this is where it becomes quite challenging, because to quantify these measures in terms of IEM input. There are a lot of measures announced already, mostly in fiscal nature. Not enough green measures so far. So most of them are either neutral or even gray. But we will be trying to use the selected green measures as input for our implemented recovery scenario. And as, for example, an extension of electric vehicle subsidies that China has announced is quite a direct measure to implement. But an expansion of China's charging network by 50% is one measure that is quite harder to quantify in terms of IEM input. Yeah. So this was my presentation on the work that we have done and we are currently doing. Thank you, and you're welcome to ask any questions you want.
So let me maybe quickly ask one myself.
Of course.
Is it the question with this type of assessment in general, is a bit, where do you draw the line between, say, announced, or how do you distinguish between things you already have to cast into your baseline and this specific new normal or COVID scenario?
So basically, behind the scenes of the COVID impact, the IMAGE team is also working on a current policies update of the baselines, which includes announced and implemented policies up to October, and then we will implement any additional measures on top of that. This is also a question of being able to distinguish the measures announced by previous policy as well, which in some cases is a bit fuzzy, but that's a big part of the work that's going on right now, being able to clearly distinguish between only COVID-related recovery measures and previous policy announced measures.
We'll go to the next presentation, and that will be Adriano VINCA, and he will be presenting, I hope once he appears here on the stage, on the green recovery after COVID, or the COVID pandemic, whether it can reduce the cost of climate change mitigation. And here he is. The floor is yours. Yes.
Okay, thanks a lot. Good afternoon. My name is Adriano VINCA. I'm a research assistant at the International Institute for Applied System Analysis. And today I'm going to talk about a green recovery after COVID-19 pandemic that can reduce costs for climate change mitigation. So pretty much similar, in line with also the presentation we've seen before. And a large number of colleagues at IIASA has also contributed to this study. As was also mentioned by our previous presenter, and as most of us has already experienced, the COVID-19 led to significant impact also on our lifestyle, which led to changes in our energy use and consequently on CO2 emission. And several studies have already assessed the first impact of lockdown measures on energy, air pollutants, and CO2 emissions, but recent developments of the pandemic has shown that the uncertainty is still high. For instance, we see second waves coming up, but also the government response around the world is heterogeneous, and therefore more analysis is needed to assess the uncertainty. And today we're focusing on two main questions. One is, what is the impact of COVID-19 on the emissions in 2020 and in the short and medium term? And then we also look at it in the perspective of climate change mitigation. So what are the COVID-19 induced behavioral and structural changes that inform new strategies for effective long climate change mitigation? And to answer that, we use an integrated assessment model, Message Globium, which is a global long-term capacity planning optimization model, and it incorporates a detailed representation of the energy sector and linked with a macroeconomic model that represent interaction between energy and the rest of the economy. Therefore, this structure allows us to basically represent changes in, especially behavioral changes in different sectors, in particular in transport, in building, and the industrial sector. And some colleagues have done a detailed bottom-up assessment of structural and behavioral changes that happened during the pandemic, and also distinguishing between responses in two macro regions that we call Global North and Global South. and they have been assessing, studying literature and other data and reports coming up, a shock in 2020, and also possible different recovery pathways, which I will discuss better later. And here we can see first results of our estimates of final energy reduction in 2020 compared to a baseline where we would have supposed no COVID, and then different recovery pathways. But at the same time, we also have done an assessment, an economic assessment on what are the, so this was the final energy pathways that have been discussing before, and we see a drop in 2020, while then we also have done a economic assessment, and here we can see we estimated the GDP reduction in 2020 and also play with uncertainty variables such as the shock and the persistent parameter and the duration of the recovery, so that we can could come up with a range of uncertainty that is here depicted by this gray area, while this thick blue line is the GDP assumption that we use for the results I'm presenting later on. Playing with two dimensions, which are whether we would return to a status as before, or we will have a future of new normality, of different status, and also the other dimension is whether we would suppose socially driven recovery, so mostly behavioral changes, or changes that would require policy support to implement. We define 4 different recovery pathways concerning energy demand and consumption. This figure is showing the main assumptions for activity changes between 2019 and 2025. And in particular, and these black lines refer to these scenarios in the bottom left corner, which we call restore scenario. And the assumption for these scenarios is that envision a return to the exact pre-pandemic condition, with the exception of industry that still suffer from economic recession. Then we have another scenario called self-reliance, where we envision persistence of individual transport and high reliance on online retail, but also homestaying and larger and safer workspaces at the same time, and more localization of industrial production. On an opposite line, we have this smart use scenario with significant reduction in current transport due to less commuting, larger use of light individual vehicles in cities, and still have an increase in homestay and home office, and small reduction in industry. And finally, this green put scenario, in which we basically take these changes and they are magnified. Behavioral changes are a stronger reduction in each sector. For instance, promotion of public and alternative transport, compensate increase in home office with reduction of physical office spaces, and repurposing of industrial production. At the same time, we do not only make assumptions on activity, but also on the structure of these sectors. For instance, on this self-reliance, we assume more private car use compared to public transport, which is opposite in the smart use and green put scenario. While on the industrial side, we have a reduction in iron, steel, and aluminum production and cement, while increasing pulp and paper and chemical and petrochemical. And these assumptions are also magnified in the green put scenario. While for this restore, we just assume that we go back as previous behavior. Some first results show the total CO2 emission globally. And we also assess, similarly to other studies, that the drop in 2020 accounts for 5 gigatons of CO2 equivalent, which is about 9% of the value of 2019. And transport sector and industry, as we could guess from our assumption, are the most drivers to this drop. Actually, building sector is showing higher CO2 emissions. And when compared to the ranges of those scenarios that are targeting a temperature increase limitation up to 1.5 degrees up by the end of the century, we see that these scenarios that include no climate policy are quite far from those targets and not really helping going into that direction. Actually, in fact, the emission would get back to 2019 levels in a time frame that would range between 3 and 6 years, according to the assumption on energy demand use. And on the other side, economic uncertainty plays a significant role. These results, a very fast economic recovery could actually jeopardize the CO2 emission reduction due to energy demand changes. On the other hand, a long recession could actually double the effect. Looking at cumulative emissions, the overall cumulative emission reduction that we account by 2030 is between 30 and 50 gigatons. And if we look at how fast the budget to stay within the Paris Agreement goals or the 1.5 goals are, we would actually still run out of this budget pretty soon. And the uncertainty that we have here just give us a few years more. So the reduction at the end are too small compared to the required mitigation efforts. But however, now we get to the second question. We would like to see how these structural and behavioral changes play a role in climate mitigation strategies. And to do that, we combine scenarios with climate target objectives, such as maintaining temperature below 1.5 or 2 degrees with these COVID-induced recovery pathways. And here I'm showing just results for 1.5 targets, but are pretty similar also for considering 2 degrees target. And this plot is showing differences compared to the restore pathways that we showed before of the most carbon intensive pathways, which was the self-reliance, and the less carbon intensive, which was the green push. First of all, we noticed that an annual post-recovery decarbonization pace is 3% lower in the green push. And here this value is broken down across sector. So it means that for each of these sector, we need to decarbonize less sharply in the coming decades. Also, energy investment costs for the green push scenario are 11% lower compared to self-reliance. And the net present value by 2030 is 23% lower. So economic impacts are quite relevant. And there are some important benefits of pursuing this green push pathway. Looking at the supply energy production, the COVID-19 shock actually reduced a lot the demand, and therefore we accounted for about 1,000 gigawatt capacity of coal electricity generation that was not needed. But in normal scenarios without climate policy, this would rapidly reuse. But in mitigation scenarios, we need to cut out coal and actually invest in low carbon technologies. And the share of renewables in 2019 globally was about 8%. And to achieve 1.5 goals, we need to sharply boost it up to 51% in the self-reliance, but only 47% in the green push. So it means that we need to invest less sharply and fast in renewables. And for the same reason, the coal scale down cannot be too sharp on self-reliance, which also sees a little bit increase in coal capacity in 2030. So all these differences show that having a different pathways in energy demand and derived by behavioral change has actually impact on climate mitigation targets. And here we jump to the conclusion that the impact of COVID-19 on our emission on the short term is not particularly significant, but the uncertainty around it is large and should not be neglected. And we also show that the recovery process can curve different emission trends and ease global mitigation efforts. And therefore, policy support is needed to guide the green recovery pathways that avoid uncontrolled behavioral change toward a carbon-intensive economy. With this, I thank you, and I'm here to get questions.
Yes. Hello, thank you. It seems you've been very clear because in the Q&A section, I don't see any questions. So thank you very much for this very clear presentation. I think it will be more discussion coming up once you have, again, some other presentation and different views So please be active then in the Q&A session or at the end of the second session where we try to have a little bit of a discussion. So at this stage, thank you very much for your presentation. And we move through to the next presentation, and the next presentation will be given by Bence Kiss-DOBRONYI, and again he will try to shed light at least on the impacts of the COVID pandemic and the recovery packages. And here he is joining us on the stage, and the floor is yours, please.
Yes, thank you very much. Hello in our presentation. Actually, so first, welcome everyone. I'm Kiss-DOBRONYI Bence from Cambridge Econometrics, and together with Patrick Tuip from Alltech Finance, we are going to talk about, once my presentation loads, we're going to talk about our assessment of the impacts of COVID-19 and in economic, in emission, and in financial terms, and a bit about our work directed towards green recovery scenarios, which similar to what we've seen before. So the presentation is going to be separated into three parts. First, I'm going to talk about our approach to actually modeling the COVID-19 effects using our E3ME FTT model, and then Patrick will talk about financial market impacts that are estimated based on that, and I will finish with a part on green recovery scenarios. So first, about our modeling of the short and medium-term effects of COVID-19 with E3ME. A quick introduction to the model that we used, E3ME and FTT. I'm happy to go into the details later, or if there are any questions on that. But what I would just like to emphasize is that E3ME and FTT is a bit different from most IAM models. Our approach is a simulation approach rather than an optimization approach. And in economic terms, it's an econometric, historical based model compared to the usual CGE approach taken by most AMs. And we also have FTT as a submodule for energy demand modeling, for energy system modeling, which is a path-dependent technology diffusion model. So we use this suite of models for estimating the immediate impact of COVID-19 on economy, energy, and emissions. And there are some cornerstones that we set out before doing any kind of modeling on this topic. First is we wanted to avoid doing any kind of health modeling because that's outside of our expertise. Due to the nature of E3ME, we are able to apply supply and demand shocks to the economy in the same time, which is really valuable in this situation. And finally, we wanted to move from observed policy to observed behavior, basically building on scenario, building on COVID impact scenario on observed activity changes rather than on policy changes. And this is just a comparison of GDP impacts with other like institutional forecasts. There is one thing that I want to highlight here. So back in July, we did two scenarios. One is what's shown here as S2, and that was a scenario where we actually assumed that there will be no second wave of the pandemic. And in the second case, this is called F3 here. We assume that there is going to be a second wave and the second lockdown, which is reality now. And what I want to emphasize here is that in our results, it's shown that the current magnitude, the short-term magnitude of the impacts, the economic impacts of COVID has an effect on how the long-term recovery looks like. And that's why we think it's important to get the short-term effects right. And I'm just going to show you a bit about that. So that's how economic effects from E3ME compare to other forecasts. But it's also important to note here that while most economic forecasts were in the right ballpark when it comes to estimating the annual effect of COVID-19 and measures designed to curb COVID-19 infections, there are some areas where models were lacking and kind of need more development. And the UK and Lithuania are examples of that. Also, I'm happy to talk about that in more detail and what we need to do about it in the future. We also estimated short-term emission impacts. As I said, in our case, it's based on historical behavior. So it's based on a linkage, a relationship between economic behavior and emissions in the past. And there is one striking point here. While most estimates were quite all right, there are cases, for example, in France, where the forecasts differ from what has been kind of observed, estimated as well by others. And this points to the direction that there are behavioral changes, such as it was shown it was noted in the previous presentations, and there are behavioral changes which mean that there could be a new kind of relationship between emissions and consumer demand in some areas, and this is something I will touch upon later on as well. And now I will hand it to Patrick to talk about financial market impacts based on this modeling.
Thank you. So for this part of the presentation, I will give a very brief walkthrough of what we have done on the basis of the outcomes of the E3ME model, because once you have the impact on economic growth of different types of developments for the COVID situation, of course, the question is, how does this translate through to other financial and economic variables? So on the first slide of this part, I have a way of looking at this that we use at Ortec Finance. So we basically look at all the items on the balance sheet of a pension fund or an asset manager or any other entity. And then we try to simulate forward what will happen to all these items. And basically, when you add them up, you will get the development of the total balance sheet, and you will, for instance, in the case of a pension fund, be able to look at coverage ratios and so forth. So on the next slide, I have some indication of how we approach the scenario construction for this, and this pertains to our baseline, and I will try to shift from this baseline description towards what we've done for the COVID scenario. So what we do, so we start from the current economic and financial market conditions. Then we have a number of stylized facts, basically common features of how the economy behaves that we can hopefully all agree on, that should be reflected by the models that we use or by our overall model. Then, of course, there may be relevant information not captured by the data. For instance, the moment the Brexit vote occurred, this was obvious from reading the newspapers. However, it was not yet sufficiently included in historical data to have it reflected appropriately going forward for the projection. So then you need to make some adjustments. And here you see how that turns out for a stochastic example. So for the sake of time, I will not spend too much time on the stochastics. I think on the next slide, here you can see, at least for the stochastic projections, that the COVID shock, here we look at the development of a balance sheet of a typical European pension fund on the asset side. You see a really large negative hit followed by a sort of U-shaped looking recovery so far. Of course, this is still not including the impact of the second lockdown. But what you can see, it was quite an extreme shock. There was also some recovery. And then if you, on the next slide, compare this to the stochastic projections that were made by the Ortec Finance model at the end of 2016, you can see that actually the current state of this balance sheet is still very much in the center of the distribution. However, going forward to, again, the next slide, right now we are in quite an interesting situation in the sense that it's important to really live through what is happening, that you can really imagine what is going to happen. And for this, narratives can help. So to really complement the more probabilistic approach, it helps to have some idea, okay, what are the out-of-the-box or more narrative ways to look at this. And on the next slide, I think, yeah, here we have summarized what we've done together with Cambridge Econometrics. So there were 3 scenarios. One is the IMF worst case development. The other one is the continued lockdown that Bence showed in the first part. And then there is also a worse development, the virus strikes back, with really repeated lockdowns over the next 5 years. On the next slide, we have a high level description of these with different kinds of economic impacts and vaccination and lockdown assumptions, and it gets worse and worse as you go from the top one to the bottom one. And on the next slide, I think I have the evolution of GDP growth in these different scenarios. So here you can really see for the next 5 years in annual time steps, what in these storylines is the projection for GDP growth. And I've also included some realizations, but on the next slide, this is the contribution of the partnership or the collaboration that we had, in the sense that we could also translate it through to what happens to corporate credits and to equity returns. And again, on the next slide, also for inflation and interest rates. And all these variables, if you have a picture of what happens to these financial market components, you can translate it to really the balance sheet level, live through what it means for you as an investor or as an affected pension fund, for instance. And interestingly, on a closing note, you can see for the US, the realization end of September looks quite positive, while for Europe, the realization is much more in line with the continued lockdown scenario, if we view the end of September realization as a sort of signpost. But of course, now in the last quarter of the year, there have been all kinds of new developments that may again change the picture going forward. But this is at least the glance that I hope to offer you. And with that, I gladly hand over to Bence for the last part.
Thank you. So this is kind of setting up the scene for the last part that I'm going to talk about, the green recovery scenarios that we investigated in our work. One of that is the work that we are doing together with Patrick and the rest for Ortec Finance. But we also just recently published 2 working papers on the topic, as well as a report sponsored by the Women Business Coalition. And in these works, we usually take an approach where there is a government kind of intervention to boost the economy, and that is how it differs, or modeling differs from what Adriano described in the previous presentation, that we assess policies rather than behavioral changes here. And from the policy perspective, financial impacts of the COVID are really important, because it is reasonable to say that if interest rates are going down, and we can hope and see that, then, and the economy is below its possible capacity constraints, then a debt-financed fiscal expansion, such as a green recovery or green policies for recovery, are feasible and viable. So what we do in our green recovery scenarios is to assess a conventional set of economy boosting policies against a green set of policies, which are basically energy system transformation, electrification of transport, and energy efficiency measures. And what we consistently find in these exercises is once, as it was shown by Ioannis in the first presentation, we see that with the conventional recovery, there is a chance that not only emissions return to baseline levels, but with the conventional recovery, it can go beyond baseline levels, therefore kind of hindering or progress in emission reductions. Contrary to that, in a green recovery scenario, we not only see a decrease of emissions, we actually estimated to emissions stabilize across around 33, 34 gigatons per year. But we also see a positive employment impact. So this is something that the governments should and could really account for, that these green policies can actually help employment as well, not just help achieve emission reduction goals. And we are also looking into regional impact, and there is just one thing to highlight here. Even though in the global level it seems like a good direction to go, results differ across regions and differ across countries. In one of the working papers, we looked at results for the Visegrad countries, and for example, Poland is important to highlight here. So in Poland, if we have a green recovery package, if we have these green recovery policies, that helps CO2 emission reductions. But on the medium and long term, if we don't have long-term policies, for example, curbing coal investments, we can return again to the same level of emissions without further policies. And I'm going to just finish here with some points that we partly touched upon and some points that are still important. Just focusing on the fourth point here, that is something that Adriano have talked about in the previous presentation. We are kind of unsure about the structure and behavioral changes, about the permanency, but there are two trends that is important to highlight. One is reshoring, that's kind of gaining attraction and can restructure global value chains. And on the other hand, what we see is a change in consumer demand and how that's structured, and that is something really important to factor in to future models. And thank you for your attention. I think we are here for questions.
Yeah, indeed, there are a number of questions. I'm afraid we cannot put all of this. I have to refer to the Q&A session again. But if you quickly, obviously, you already pointed at the interesting differences between the modeling and the observed effect for some countries. If you quickly could give us some outlook what reasons could be behind that. So if it will take obviously longer, but maybe you can also answer that in the Q&A, but give the general audience a glimpse of what could be the reason for that.
Yes, so let me just do that in like 40 seconds. So if we quickly go back here, just talking about GDP impact. So for the UK, it's actually kind of evident at this point, but most of these forecasts were done during the summer, and actually because of policy changes and because how lockdown went on for a longer period in the UK, some of the impacts that they had actually went into the third quarter rather than the second quarter, and that is something that was not taken into account in modeling. And the Lithuanian case is really interesting and a bit complex also. But basically, what happened there is that the Lithuanian economy was really resilient to COVID impacts because of the export structure and because of an increase in their incomes in the beginning of the year. So this kind of offset the negative demand effect, because the income effects led to an increase in demand, and then the COVID impacts led to a decrease in demand. And so we got to a similar level to what we've seen in 2019.
Okay. Very interesting indeed, but we have to continue. So thanks again, both of you, for the presentation, and hope you continue discussing on the Q&A. So next presentation, again, we have another look, this time focusing on the long-term climate scenarios and the response of the COVID. Again, and this will be a presentation given by Lilia CAIADO, and I hope she will be, and here she is. Very good. Floor is yours.
Okay, so good morning, afternoon, or evening. I'll be talking you through this ongoing effort that we're doing. It's a quite collective effect, as you can see, the names of my colleagues from COUTO, the Federal University of Rio de Janeiro. We're working towards long-term climate scenarios for the aftermath of the COVID-19 crisis. So we're assessing the economic response to the crisis. Yeah, this is work in progress, so feedback will be very much welcome. I won't go through all of the background information because this is a quite dedicated session, so you already know. I'll focus on what we're doing, like and unlike the colleagues that have already presented. So as I said, one of the particular aspects of what we're doing is that we're looking at the very long term. And so we're of course not looking at short-term effects of lockdown, for example. We are considering more the possible trajectory shifts caused by economic recovery strategies. So the packages that are being launched or pledged, the stimulus translated into infrastructure investment that can ultimately cause stranded assets if they are mostly brown or fossil fuel based. And in the near future, right after this recovery period, if climate policy becomes more stringent, we can experience those stranded assets. Our research objective is to estimate the extent to which a fossil fuel based recovery packages with stimulus to fossil fuel intensive sectors, how this can hinder the achievement of climate targets, or how a brown economic recovery could make achieving climate targets more costly. So we're using the COFFEE IAM suite as our modeling framework. We use the TEA CGE model to model GDP growth in the long term and sectoral demands that will be used as inputs to the COFFEE model. The COFFEE model is a partial equilibrium global model for the energy and land systems. So the COFFEE model has, as results, these scenarios that we're working on. Both of the models have the same 18 regions. So we're doing a quite regional approach, looking at the recovery packages for each of the regions, and also modeling GDP growth shocks for each of the regions, and then trying to see this long-term impact. So our scenario design encompasses 4 scenarios. First, a baseline with COVID. So it's in the SSP2 regionally, but we applied to the baseline these short-term regional GDP growth shocks from the World Economic Outlook, the update of the World Economic So we are using the latest forecast for GDP growth shocks for each of the regions, and no additional economic recovery policy. So this is an interesting bit. There was already a question how to draw this line and we're doing quite much effort on that. So the second scenario is the pledged recovery packages scenario with no carbon budget. So we're considering mixed stimulus because when we assess the economic recovery packages that have been pledged, we could identify a very mixed profile. So there's the greenest stimulus index that has been cited before by VINCA Economics. They do this comparison between greenness and brownness of the packages, and we're working also on this concept, on this mix with our pledged recovery scenario. Then we have our third scenario, which is well below 2 degrees, not considering recovery packages. So this would be the ideal. So if we had a fully green scenario, it would ideally look like this. So it's also framed within the SSP2 rationale, applying also the short-term GDP growth shocks like the baseline, but with the carbon budget of 600 gigatons CO2. Staying well below 2 degrees, roughly 1.7 degrees with 66% probability. Our fourth scenario is like the third, combined with the second. So we have a scenario with a carbon budget, the same carbon budget, but also considering these pledged scenarios, which are mostly to the brown fossil fuel based side. So we'll be able to see if what has been pledged, to which extent what has been pledged impacts the achievement of the target. So as I said before, if it makes achieving the target more costly, if it delays action. So as I said, we're using the latest World Economic Outlook. The shocks presented there were applied to the TEA CGE. So the main conclusions, the overview of the shocks are that, except for China, GDP, both in advanced and emerging economies, remain below 2019 levels up to 2021, and countries that rely more on they're more contact intensive, and also oil exporters due to the deep steep decrease in oil prices, they face weaker recoveries or slower recoveries, economic recoveries, compared to more industrialized countries. So this is our results for the GDP growth with the COVID-19 shock. So we updated a bit the historical values for between 2011 and 2020 from the SSP2 values. And we, as I said, we applied these short-term GDP growth regional charts and modeled for the rest of the period. And these are our GDP growth curves for like SSP2, of course, a baseline pre-COVID and a baseline post-COVID with COVID. This would be the final energy consumption and regional electricity generation, the baseline considering COVID, results from the TEA CGE model, not yet applied to the coffee pressure equivalent model. So here you can see the break-in interest rate. So as I mentioned, we're working with 18 regions. We're doing this detailed assessment of each of the recovery packages that have been pledged by regions. Very heavy effort because it's a bit hard to translate what they pledge into actual technological constraints. Something that looks more concrete on what these pledges will be translated into. So we have this total packages value of 12.2 trillion from JRC 2020. It's important to note that this is a total, including rescue. So, for example, liquidity support and even healthcare is within this. And the three largest packages are first the US with 2.3 trillion. There's, of course, lots of uncertainty regarding how the US, how brown or green the US recovery package will end up being. So we're working with what has already been implemented and trying to understand how to deal with that kind of uncertainty, because there is this shift and the president-elect pledged 1.7 trillion to climate action next year. So then the second largest package is from Japan with 2.7 trillion, mostly brown, at least where we're getting the information from, but mostly pledged to oil and gas. And then the third largest package is from the European Union with 1.46 trillion, mostly green, with this indication of at least 30% of the 750 billion borrowing to climate action, with the rest of it with the clause to do no harm. And then there are, of course, other very relevant packages pledged, like China and Brazil, with roughly from 200. Here is an example of regions of our analysis of what we are doing with the information we're getting from the packages. So, as I said, we are working with 18 different regions, but here I just put some from the largest packages to show we're working mostly with power and transport sectors, so the technologies. So we get the information from, we start with a very rough monetary value for the entire package, and then we try to filter what is in there for energy, and then we try to dig out what is which technologies are encompassed and how much goes to each of the technologies, and turn that into actual technological constraints to the model. So, yeah, for example, let me see. Yeah, here we have addition, and it's very important to focus on the additionality of it, not to double count from baseline, or to be able to separate what would be baseline anyways and what is additional post-COVID stimulus. So we have, for example, this 69 billion additional to OEG's subsidies that we identified in the US as something pledged additionally to the baseline, focused on the post-COVID recovery. So as I said, some of the data sources that we're using, Energy Policy Tracker that has an overview of spending to each of the energy sources, and then we dig out, because there is a list of policies and we see each of the policies from each of the regions, each of the countries, and also the IMF policy responses. But this is again something that we get first a rough idea of the package's value, and then we have to dig into each of them to understand how they translate into investment in one or another technology. Yeah, so we still don't have results from the coffee model, but as I said, what we are aiming to get are the results from those 4 scenarios, saying to say how much an economic an economic recovery based on fossil fuels mostly might affect the long-term response to climate emergency, how it may delay climate action or make it more costly, and to which extent it would a brown recovery, fossil fuel-based recovery would create stranded assets if climate policy becomes more stringent right out. Thank you. So open to questions or.
Okay, thank you. That was within time, but Audrey, you took your discussion time as well. So I'm afraid, again, I have to refer to the Q&A session and to try to be, not to eat into the next session, we pass to the next presentation, which will try to give a deeper dive, if I can interpret it as that, which is the effect of investment in the electricity sector, and also, as the session says, related to COVID. And this would be Daniel Gingerich. Please.
Let me get my presentation up. All right, wonderful. So, I am Professor Daniel Gingerich. I'm a faculty member in the College of Engineering at The Ohio State University. And I am going to be talking about the impact of investments in the electricity sector, presenting some work in progress that I'm doing along with my colleagues here at Ohio State, Professors Jeffrey Bolecki and Yue Chin. It should really come as no surprise to anyone that we have a history, and societies have a history of investing their way out of economic crises, at least within the past 100 years. This picture is people leaving work at a Tennessee Valley Authority facility. For those of you who do not know, the Tennessee Valley Authority was an important part of President Franklin Delano Roosevelt's economic recovery plans during the Great Depression. It also played an instrumental role in rural electrification in the United States and the development of nuclear power in the US as well. We then saw investment in the electricity sector again in the Great Recession under President Obama in 2009 and 2010 in terms of enabling renewable energy, in particular investment in wind and solar technology. And so it should come as no surprise, really, that we see discussions in both parties here in the United States in terms of thinking about the way that investment in the electricity sector can help us get out of the current economic crisis caused by the COVID-19 economic shutdown. And so I'm going to dive in and talk a little bit more about that today. In particular, I want to focus in on understanding how we can evaluate trade-offs in life cycle job creation and carbon dioxide emissions that come about from investing in different types of electricity capacity. And then I also want to talk about differences that we see between states in the United States when it comes to job creation and investments in electricity capacity, and thinking about ways that we can leverage state-level differences in economic factors in order to build a broad base of public support for green recovery packages here in the US. So quickly talking about some work, I'm going to kind of breeze through this, but feel free to reach out if you have more questions later or talk in the Q&A period. So what my colleagues and I have done is built this model called the Infrastructure System Investment Climate, Labor, and Environmental Synergies Model, or ISICLES model. The way the model works is a user defines information about a particular type of electricity capacity that you want to invest in. Most notably, what type of capacity you want to invest in. And right now, the model has 9 different types of electricity generation potential that you can look at. We're also going to ask information about where are you building this capacity, how often and how frequently is it being operated, what is its expected lifespan, and of course, how much are you willing to invest in that particular capacity in that location. And then we use this model to calculate the levelized cost of electricity from that investment and that capacity that you've just built, as well as how much capacity you can construct overall. Once we have an estimate of how much capacity can be constructed based on an investment of a given size, the model will then estimate the amount of jobs created and carbon dioxide that's emitted over the lifespan of that capacity, so both during the construction phase and during the plant's operation. Underlying all of these estimates is a rich data set from a variety of sources here in the United States that we have underlying and informing our model and our ability to project these things. So I want to dive now quickly into some of our results. And this graph is showing us for the entire United States what the trade-offs are for the 9 different types of energy capacity that we're looking at We have the full gamut of carbon dioxide, CO2 emitting coal, all the way down to lower CO2 emitting sources like hydropower here in the United States. On the graph itself, the x-axis is the amount of jobs that are created or averaged over the lifespan of the technology per gigawatt hour. These are in full-time equivalent. So in the United States, a full-time equivalent is roughly equivalent to 40 hours of work per week for 50 weeks per year. On the y-axis, we have the amount of CO2 that's emitted over the lifespan of the technology. Again, average per gigawatt hour of electricity generated, using some base case assumptions for capacity factor and project lifespan. Just a technical note, the tons here, these are short tons, not metric tons. And they range from roughly 0.8 tons per gigawatt hour for the hydropower sources all the way up to almost 1,000 tons of CO2 per gigawatt hour for coal. We also have the amount of capacity that can be built for a $10 million investment for each of these technologies as well on this graph. And what we see if we look at the graph is it's a pretty clear Pareto frontier when we look at geothermal and hydropower investment. And so what this means is that if a regulator or a policymaker only cared about maximizing job production, they would invest almost all of their funds in geothermal. And if they wanted to minimize the amount of CO2 that results from these investments, they would invest almost entirely in hydropower. However, we can't really do that. That's not technically feasible here in the US, in part because of the significant geospatial constraints that these technologies have. You can only have geothermal in the US with current technologies really in the western half of the country, leaving pretty much everything east of the Rocky Mountains, so a population base, without kind of access to this energy sources or without the jobs that are going to be created from building geothermal power. And then hydropower, you obviously need flowing water and changes in elevation in order to make that work. And that's also geospatially constrained. And so what we need to think about then is maybe the second frontier right here of the good enough technologies consisting of nuclear, onshore wind, and solar PV, if only because these technologies have a much more widely distributed potential here in the US in terms of the resources necessary to make them work. And so investments in these technologies are probably going to be more feasible, at least in the short term. So I'm not going to talk a bit and dive in. All of those numbers I just showed were averages for the entire United States. So I want to do a bit of spatial variation and think about what it looks like at the state level here in the US. Because the state level is really important when you think about how American politics works. And so what I'm showing on this graph is for a $10 million investment in onshore wind, South Carolina and Washington are the states that have the most extreme variation in job production over the lifespan of that investment. So in South Carolina, that $10 million in onshore wind can be used to produce 102 full-time equivalents, whereas in Washington, that's only 54 full-time equivalents produced. I've also broken down on this graph and the graph I'm about to show you jobs in terms of where they are produced in the lifespan of the project, whether they're on-site jobs to actually build the capacity or operate it, whether they're jobs produced in the supply chain in order to manufacture the turbine blades or the other machinery for these wind farms, or if they're jobs that are induced in the local economy. So these are jobs that are produced from the factory or from the workers who are on site going into town to buy lunch and spending kind of money in the economy in order to produce new jobs in the cities where the wind farms are located. And what we see if we're trying to understand the differences from where this comes from, it's not in the construction phase. South Carolina and Washington have very similar construction phase numbers. Instead, the differences really come about in the operation phase. And that's what this graph is showing us, is for this $10 million investment, how many full-time equivalents are produced per year. And what we see is about there's 1.5 jobs produced in Washington per year, and roughly 3.5 full-time equivalents in South Carolina per year. And the differences here are because of the supply chain differences in these states and induced differences in these states. South Carolina has a much more complete manufacturing base already on the ground, and so it can capture and create more of those supply chain jobs within the state. But there's also a significant difference in terms of thinking about the cost of living in these two states. And because the cost of living is so different, there can be much more induced jobs that are created as a result of investment in South Carolina. And we see these trends appearing for other technologies too, that it's differences in the supply job creation that are going to cause significant variation for other technologies as well. So that's something that's really important to understand and think about when we're deciding how we want to design green economic recovery packages in the United States. It's thinking not just about the places where we will be building the renewable capacity, but also where are we going to be citing the manufacturing capability and thinking about induced jobs in those areas. And that's actually an important piece of this puzzle that we need to think about. And so kind of to quickly wrap up to try to keep us a bit on time, really what we needed to focus on, and kind of the key takeaway from this work so far, is that electricity sector investments need to recognize spatial variability in resources and economics. That resource base is going to constrain what we can deploy and where we can deploy it, especially if we want to build that broad base of public support across the United States, which is really important given how our system works. But also, as I just mentioned, there's also importance in thinking about how we direct investment in manufacturing capacity to places that may not be the most efficient when it comes to actually generating renewable energy. Can we, if we can't build geothermal plants here in Ohio where I am located because we just don't have geothermal resources, can we think deliberately about how we set manufacturing policy in the US in order to manufacture the pieces that we might need for those geothermal plants here in Ohio and build support like that? With that, I want to thank my co-authors for this project, Professors Jeff Bilecki and Yue Chin, as I just mentioned, as well as my funding source for this work, which is the Ohio State University's Office of Research COVID-19 Seed Grant Program. And with that, I will take questions or either in the Q&A or chat box or later on in the second session. So.
Yes, thank you very much for rushing a bit through this.
Sorry if it was fast.
The presentation. No, I'm afraid everybody has to in a way, because we are almost actually through our session, and we are, if we are not very quick, we eat into the next one. That's really interesting stuff. For us, or most of us, say, having the global view, then this is the challenge: how to bridge, say, this, say, 11 region global model to reasoning analysis that you're doing. So, and see how to bridge that gap and work together in the future. I don't see any immediate urgent questions. So again, I know Volker is. He still wants, maybe you can try to explain it here or later in the Q&A. He still doesn't see the large difference you showed in the supply chain. So if you can give it another try, in another 2 or 3 minutes.
Yeah, I can certainly try. So I think the difference in the supply chain jobs really comes down to the fleetness in terms of thinking about how many jobs can South Carolina capture versus how many jobs are going to have to be performed in other states, or how many pieces are going to have to be manufactured in other states. So because South Carolina has a more broad manufacturing base, they can manufacture more of the components that are going to be required to build this wind farm within the state. Without having to go outside of the state to the to say neighboring states like Georgia or farther afield where we, like Wisconsin, we tend to have more manufacturing capabilities. Washington, on the other hand, does not have a manufacturing-based economy. It's agriculturally focused and or technology focused. And so it doesn't have manufacturing capabilities really within the state to an extent that would allow it to capture those jobs pretty effectively. And then the induced job differences, or the differences in induced economies and induced local job creation is largely because dollars can go farther. So I can pay my workforce in South Carolina roughly what I might pay them. Their dollars are going to be able to go farther within South Carolina because it's going to be cheaper to live there. You can, it's going to be cheaper to go out and buy food, and so you will go out and buy more food, or you'll go out and eat more frequently and create more jobs in restaurants as a result. Or in the end, it comes down to just your dollar being able to go farther within a state like South Carolina than in a state like Washington. And because your job can go farther, you can give more of it to the economy and produce more jobs because it is spent in more places.
All right. We gave it a try.
That helps. If not,
we have to continue the Q&A. And finally, thanks very much. Very interesting talk. And then that brings us to our last presentation, again on the impact of the COVID crisis on climate policy and faster or slower decarbonization. And this will be presented by Silvia PIANTA, and here she is. The floor is yours.
Okay. So first, thank you all to all the previous speakers for very interesting presentations. And I will present something a bit different based on a survey of policymakers and stakeholders, but I think this can be a nice complement to what we've seen so far. I'm a researcher at the RFF-CMCC European Institute on Economics and Environment in Milan, and I present here joint work with Elina Bruchin and Bas van Ruven from IIASA and Valentina Botetti from CMCC. And this work is part of the stakeholder elicitation process of the Engage research project. So, do you see the second slide? Yes. What we wanted to assess here is when the pandemic started, we wanted to get some informed expectations by policymakers and stakeholders on the likely medium-term impact of the crisis and its economic implications on decarbonization efforts. And the main question was, will the response to the crisis crowd out mitigation efforts or create synergies leading to a green recoveries? And we also wanted to assess or get insights on the likely regional differences in the impact of the crisis on climate policies. So there are a number of reasons to think that there is now a window of opportunity for more ambitious climate action. And I think this has not been mentioned so far, but in 2019, we have seen unprecedented climate mobilization and also a change in individual climate attention and attitudes. And this could be a reason beside technical reasons and government policies that could make a green transition more likely in the next few years. And we have also seen a change in attitudes of government, who have a much more proactive fiscal approach compared to the 2008 crisis. And yes, of course, we also have lower renewable energy prices and clean tech market progress, and this makes government investments in green sectors more attractive. Of course, the recovery packages that will be decided in the next months or that are now discussed and the climate policy decisions in the next 5 years will determine whether we will, in the end, reach probably the Paris Agreement goal. And there is a recent study by Hector and co-authors at Oxford who identified policies with both high economic multiplier and a positive climate potential. So that could really lead to a green recovery. And of course, it would be ideally if all countries implemented those policies, but ultimately decisions are political. So what we wanted to assess is like the likelihood of green political decisions now when most policy recovery packages and climate policies are still in progress and are still discussed. And so maybe this can complement more official data provided by governments. What we did, we developed a policymaker and stakeholder survey, and we were able to administer it to 2023 people from 55 different countries. And I would like to thank again all the engaged team for helping with the data collection, because getting very busy people to answer surveys is never easy. And we developed a snowball sampling technique from different seeds in order to be able to cover the widest set of countries and in particular top emitters. And we had a set of questions on expectations on country level policies in the next 5 years. The data collection started at the end of May and lasted until mid-October. And this is just to give you a geographical overview, an overview of our geographical coverage. As you can see, we cover very well OECD countries, but we also were able to reach approximately 50 respondents from Asian and Latin American countries. So of course, it's a pity that we don't cover all the regions of the world, but these 3 regions together, and in particular OECD and Asia, are responsible for approximately 90% of global emissions. So understanding what is happening there already provides important insights. So we will be presenting results focusing on these 3 regions. And to give you an overview of the respondents that we were able to reach, we were aiming especially at government policymakers. So we reached many of them, but also our sample includes researchers and academics and people working for NGOs, IOs, and to a lower extent, the private sector and think tanks. So we'll give you a short overview of the results, just to give you an idea on how to interpret the graphs. The answers to the questions were based on 7-point Likert scales, from significantly decrease to significant increase. So when you see red, it means that there is an expected decrease, and when you see blue colors, there is an expected increase, and the darker the color, the more the responses are on the poles, on the extremes of the Likert scale. If we focus on expectations on emission trends in the next 5 years, we can see that clearly emissions are expected to decrease in OECD countries, but also Asian countries. Expectations are different on Latin American countries, but this might be not too much of a concern because this region is responsible for a lower amount of global emissions, a lower proportion of global emissions. As to public spending for climate mitigation, expectations are rather optimistic in OECD countries, but they're not very clear in Asian countries and very pessimistic in Latin American countries. We also assessed expectations on the impacts of the crisis on carbon pricing schemes. Expectations are not clear in none of the regions here, both for carbon taxes and for cap and trade systems. But these, again, are data aggregated at the regional level, and when we focus at the country level, we find different results. And let's say the most optimistic things that we find is that expectations on a set of policies supporting renewables are very positive, and in particular, expectations on investments in clean energy infrastructure and clean research and development are extremely optimistic, and this is true both for OECD countries, but also for Asian countries. Expectations on subsidies to renewables are a bit more moderate, but still positive in all the regions. We then assessed expectations on the continued or non-continued support for high carbon sectors. And as you can see, financial support for high carbon energy and industry sectors is not expected to suddenly disappear. And in particular, airline bailouts in OECD, but also Asian countries, are considered extremely likely. And this, of course, might slow down decarbonization efforts globally. But to end with a more positive result, an interesting sector to look at is, of course, the transport sector, because during the pandemic, we have seen a fast change in mobility behavior, and we can think that these behavioral changes may become more permanent if combined with investment in clean transport infrastructure. And expectations on governments' investment on clean long distance and urban transport infrastructure are very positive. And interesting, they're even more positive for Asian countries than for OECD countries, although the difference is very small. And therefore, we might think that this clean infrastructure investment may make the low carbon transition in the transport sector much more smooth and fast. So just to sum up, I presented some of the results of survey of policymakers and stakeholders, and the objective of the survey was to provide informed expectations on medium-term impacts of the crisis on climate policies in a moment when most recovery packages and policy decisions are still in progress. Overall, we see relatively positive expectations, especially on OECD and Asian countries, which are responsible for approximately 90% of global emissions, so this is good news. But on the other hand, support for incumbent and high-emitting sector will not likely immediately stop. We have very positive expectations with respect to policy with both high economic multiplier and positive climate potential, so this might indicate that a green push is relatively likely. And in the end, we will have to see what decisions will be made by the EU for the Green Deal and by China, who has recently announced the zero carbon target in 2060, and also what the US administration will decide. This is our objective was just to provide some insights when policy decisions are still under discussion and so are uncertain. And we hope that this can also inform and complement modeling efforts made today. So thanks again, and I will unshare my screen.
Thank you.